John Reed and many others say they were taken by surprise when the country's biggest financial institutions went bust in 2008. But it wasn't as if they hadn't been warned.
I believe that when this legislation is enacted...
Remember Byron Dorgan? He sounded the alarm about the dangers of striking down Glass-Steagall, but his concerns were dismissed by Wall Street, by the Clinton White House, and most of his own colleagues in Congress. But on the day of the vote, the senator from North Dakota gave one of the most prescient speeches in our political history.
I worry very much that the fusing together of the idea of banking, which requires not just safety and soundness to be successful, but the perception of safety and soundness, to merge it with inherently risky, speculative activity is, in my judgment, unwise. I think we will, in 10 years' time, look back and say we should not have done that.
10 years later, 2008, your prophecy came true. Our financial system came crashing down, and taxpayers, as you had predicted, had to bail out the banks, just as you said we would. You take any pleasure out of being right?
No, I mean, there's no pleasure in this country for what happened.
What did you know that no one else knew?
I don't know that I knew something. I felt something very important about all of this. I had read what went on in the Great Depression, kind of understood what caused a collapse back then and the unbelievable heartbreak and pain in this country, closing of the banks and people losing their jobs and losing hope and so on. Well, we put together a remedy as a result of what had caused the Great Depression, the speculation, the orgy of greed and so on Wall Street. The remedy was Glass-Steagall and other protections. It said we're going to separate banking from the more risky enterprises, real estate, securities, insurance. And so we're not going to let this happen again. And that legislation was passed, and it lasted for, 70 years or so, and worked well for this country. And then all of a sudden what happened with the shift politically were those that had capital in this country, Wall Street and others, had a profound influence on the political class and said, you know what, we want to change this in our interest. We want to get rid of Glass-Steagall. Let's throw aside these barriers because we want to do what we want to do. And they just caused an avalanche of effort here in Congress to decide we've got to get rid of Glass-Steagall. It's old-fashioned, it hurts America, and so on. This was not thoughtful. This wasn't a bunch of people in a room with the best minds in the country thinking, what might be the consequences of doing this? Have we really thought through what the consequences might be, having gone through a Great Depression once as a result of banks fused with risky ventures? And I don't think it ever became a moment in which really good people sat down and evaluated what are the consequences of this. And one of the reasons for it is the green lights that were signaling at these intersections from the President, Secretary of the Treasury, key people in Congress were saying, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this because it'll be good for the country. And it became a chorus of voices from all sides raised in support of repealing Glass-Steagall because it was old-fashioned, no longer needed. It was necessary to be repealed so that we could be competitive with the European banks. Of course, that was all nonsense.
It had this fancy name, the Financial Services Modernization Act, but its real purpose was to kill these banking protections, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, this country's been modernized before by special interests that wanted to get a bigger slice of the pie for themselves. But no matter what they called it here, the Modernization Act, this was the biggest financial interest of the country trying to grab more money from themselves. They chafed under regulations. They didn't like regulations. And they were busy creating all kinds of exotic instruments and credit default swap CDOs. I mean, the list is endless, and making very big fees, getting unbelievably wealthy doing it, and injuring this country and putting us in a position where we almost saw a complete collapse of the American economy through the greatest amount of greed, I think, perhaps in the history of the country. And there's bipartisan responsibility for it. Alan Greenspan bears a significant part of the responsibility, I should say, because he sat and watched it all on his hands when he had supervisory responsibility over the investment banks. But the Congress, the president, what this country did was unthinkable.
As he signed the bill, President Clinton handed the first pen to free market Republican Phil Gramm of Texas, who had worked long and hard to eliminate Glass-Steagall. It was later reported that another pen went to Sandy Weill at Citigroup.
Somebody ought to track that pen down and destroy it. There's no honor in what that pen did. I think if you were to rank big mistakes in the history of this country, that was one of the bigger ones, because it has set back this country in a very significant way and caused so much heartbreak and heartache and a near total collapse of the American economy. It's very much like what we're hearing today. I heard it this morning on the radio. The biggest problem in this country, they say, is regulation. Really, what kind of regulation? Now, you know, all of the mantra with the Republican candidates running for president is we've got to get rid of regulation, I'm very surprised in the shadow of what happened when we most recently got rid of regulation. I'm very surprised anybody has the willingness to say that publicly, and yet they do. Does anybody really, really believe that it is okay for financial institutions in this country to trade tens and tens and tens of trillions of dollars of credit default swaps in which they have no insurable interest on either side, just making wagers, casino wagers? But at least in casinos they have bright lights so you can see what they're doing. You know, I mean, these financial institutions at Wall Street, you didn't see any spotlights inside of those institutions so that all of us could see what was happening.
You warned in that speech that if we took this direction, encouraging, allowing mergers and conglomerations, it would create institutions too big to fail.
Right. That's exactly what happened. And sadly, even though there were institutions too big to fail that had become bigger since the repeal of Glass-Steagall, now they're even larger as a result of the bailouts, and we still have a too big to fail doctrine because those big financial institutions, and by the way, they are still gambling today, it isn't shut down, so they are bigger than ever. I tried to pass some legislation in Dodd-Frank that says if you are too big to fail, you're too damn big, and you should be broken up. I tried to pass legislation to say it shall be illegal to have naked credit default swaps. You've got to have an insurable interest. Dodd-Frank passed with my vote because it does some good things and moves in the right direction, but it is timid. It doesn't, if you were going to address the real causes here, you would decide that too big to fail cannot be tolerated. If you're too big to fail, we need to be slicing away at those enterprises and bring them back down to size. Now, how does that happen? It happens because those who are at the top of the income ladder have enormous clout. They have the ability to hire people and have their will in this debate on public policy. And all the rest of those folks, they don't have anybody that they've hired to say, look after my interests. And I think history shows that in every country where you have an unbelievable maldistribution of income, where you have just a few that are very, very, very wealthy, and then a lot of others who don't have very much, that's not a recipe for having economic growth and opportunity and expansion for all people. It just, you know, we know what that causes. So when we see this growing inequality of income, it means our country's headed towards a future in which we won't have the same opportunity generally for the American people that we've experienced in the past.
Senator, I appreciate very much you giving me your time this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Bill.
Read this one by Peter Schweitzer. Throw them all out. How politicians and their friends get rich off insider stock tips, land deals, and cronyism that would send the rest of us to prison. Peter Schweitzer is a fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, a conservative think tank, and he's just as outraged as the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Streeters are at corruption hidden in plain sight. He begins his book quoting the notorious George Washington Plunkett, who got rich as a New York City party boss at Tammany Hall in the 1870s. Quote, "There is so much honest graft in this big town that they would be fools to go in for dishonest graft." Washington today.